Okay, why don't we start? Usually when we think about altered states of consciousness, we think about states of consciousness that are changed by something that's done to the subject. You hit the person over the head and he goes into a coma. It's late at night and the person goes to sleep. You hypnotize the subject, the person takes some kind of drug, whatever it is that you've got to induce a state of consciousness that's different from what the person is used to experiencing ordinarily. What I want to do this week is to introduce you to some states of consciousness that are altered states of consciousness for sure, but which don't have that quality of being associated with a particular induction procedure. And especially they're not associated with any kind of idea that something is being done to somebody else. Rather, in these states, the person is doing it all by him or herself. Now, that's not a strict distinction between what we're going to talk about this week and what we've talked about in the past, because in a sense, all hypnosis is self-hypnosis. The hypnotist doesn't really hypnotize the subject, just kind of gives the subject a set of instructions about how to go into hypnosis. But here, I think, the idea that this is something, these are states that people enter pretty much on their own well, it's clearer. So what are we talking about? We're talking about various states that are associated with alterations in attention. And some of these occur under ordinary circumstances, in the ordinary course of everyday living, and we could call these everyday states of altered consciousness, because they're the kinds of states that everybody experiences from time to time in normal life. First, there are states that we'll call absorption or flow, where you get very intensely absorbed in some kind of activity, whether it's playing a game or reading a book or watching a novel or watching a movie or whatever. And then there are states of daydreaming and mind wandering when you're supposed to be doing something else, but instead your mind slips off to what happened last weekend, or thoughts about your ex-girlfriend, or whatever it is that your mind slips into when that kind of thing happens. And second, there are a set of what we might call more exotic states, which are associated with various kinds of mystical traditions, not just Eastern mystical, though those are the ones that get studied most often. Meditative states associated either with the Hindu yoga the tradition, or associated with the Buddhist Zen tradition. We're going to talk about those exotic states on Wednesday. Today, we're going to talk about everyday life. And let's begin with absorption, which is defined as a construct that's been around for a long time in many guises, but is currently defined as a kind of state of cognitive restructuring involving both the subject, him or herself, and what are known in the trade as ego boundaries. That is, the boundary between self and other, the boundary between subject and object, the boundary between perceiver and object of perception. In either, however you want to think about it, these are states of very narrowly focused attention. Your attention is focused intensely on one particular thing to the exclusion of all other things. And what happens when you go into these things is that you experience what might be called a departure from everyday modes of thought. Yeah?
Why is it called restructuring of self?
Well, it's a restructuring of the perception of the oneself, which is...
Why restructuring? Why not structuring?
Well, because you've already got a structure for the self, okay, which is how you think about yourself in ordinary life. I think of myself as different from this podium, as different from you, as different from my computer or whatever. But in a state of absorption, suppose you and I were madly in love, okay? We might experience a kind of blurring of the boundaries between us, so that I now feel what you feel and try to project myself into your mind and all of that kind of business. That would be a restructuring. of the self. Same thing if I were reading a book. Here I am, here's my book, it's a story, it's out there, but I can get so involved in the act of reading that I forget I'm reading a book and begin to feel like somehow I'm part of the story. So there's a restructuring of self-perception. Perhaps we just to kind of give some more examples of this. Auke Tellegen at the University of Minnesota became very interested in this a couple of years ago, a couple of decades ago, and he constructed a questionnaire, which is up on the course website. You can complete it if you want. You might do this in the discussion section this week, in which he tried to think about all the different ways in which people could manifest this kind of absorption, and then went on to write questionnaire items, trying to tap these various aspects. So, for example, he thought that absorption involved a state of responsiveness to highly engaging, or what he called inductive stimuli. Engaging movies, engaging books, not your biochemistry textbook necessarily, but a spy thriller, Hunger Games, Harry Potter for little kids, Harry Potter for older kids. Those kinds of things are what he means by engaging or inductive stimuli. There's some stimulus in the environment on which the person focuses his or her attention. Often these stimuli involve often these states involve very vivid images, a shift from propositional or verbal thought to non-propositional or imagistic thought. People in this state of absorption often experience what are known as cross-modal experiences, kind of like synesthesia, where something is presented in one modality may be experienced in other kinds of modalities. The person, as the name of the state implies, becomes very absorbed in his or her own internal thoughts and imaginings, not so much in what's going on in the outside world. At a memory level, the person may experience not just thinking about the past, not just recalling the past, but when you recall the past, it's as if you're living the event all over again, with all the emotion that's attached to it. These states can often involve a feeling of expanded awareness. I'll give you an example of that in a second. But basically, these states are experienced by other people as involving a state of consciousness that's different from ordinary when you become involved in these kinds of absorbing experiences. Here are some examples from Tellegen's questionnaire, give you a better example of what these things are all about. Responsiveness to engaging stimuli. I can be deeply moved by a sunset. You go out on the shore, the sun's setting over the Golden Gate Bridge, and you can just get swept away by that. But not just by sunsets. You can get swept away by paintings. You can get swept away by music. Put in Agata Davida on your CD player, and pretty soon you're in a different world entirely, so I'm told. Synesthesia, okay, here's a good example. Some music reminds me of pictures or changing color patterns. Well, musical notation isn't pictorial in that sense. There aren't necessarily changing color patterns, but as I'll show you next week, there are some examples where music has a kind of synesthetic quality to it. Enhanced cognition. I can often somehow sense the presence of another person before I actually see or hear him or her. It's not necessarily a parapsychological experience here, but just a kind of intuition that somebody is present. And in absorption, we're often very open to these kinds of intuitions. Obliviousness, or what Tellegen calls dissociative involvement, making it so that the rest of the world just kind of doesn't intrude on your experience. You're watching a movie and your cell phone rings and you don't pay any attention to it at all. It keeps going off, bothering everybody around you, but you're just not processing it all. Vivid reminiscences, again, this reliving of the past. And then finally, enhanced awareness captured by this wonderful phrase. Things that might seem meaningless to others often make sense to me. When administering this questionnaire, once had a subject put up his hand and say, "What does this mean?" You know, and I didn't want to be unpleasant about it, but if you don't know what it means, you haven't had that experience, right? It's kind of one of these ineffable sorts of things. Interestingly, absorption plays a role in the major theory of personality today. Those of you who have taken Professor John's course in personality psychology will recognize absorption as one of the components of the so-called Big Five personality traits: neuroticism, extroversion, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and openness to experience. The idea behind the Big Five is that individual differences in personality, the gist of a person's personality that makes him or her different from everybody else, can be captured by locating that individual as a point in a five-dimensional space, the five dimensions being the Big Five dimensions of personality. And according to our best account of this, the Big Five structure, openness to experience is one of these five dimensions. And as you can see, at least some of the aspects of openness to experience have this quality of absorption to them. Richness of fantasy life and awareness of inner feelings and all of that. There are other aspects of openness to experience, however, that don't seem to involve absorption. And in fact, there are reasons for thinking that the Big Five trait of openness to experience really covers three quite different things. The element of openness that we're going to talk about today is really about absorption, but there's also embedded in the openness to experience part of the Big Five structure, kind of socio-political liberalism, and finally a kind of what personality psychologists used to call intellectance, which is not being smart, but looking smart, okay? Having highfalutin intellectual interests and all of that, not necessarily correlated with IQ. And just as an example, it turns out that if you split openness to experience up into its three components, absorption, socio-political liberalism, and intellectance, only one of these actually correlates with hypnotizability. You'd expect absorption to be correlated with hypnotizability because hypnosis involves becoming intensely absorbed in various kinds of imaginative experiences that have been suggested by the hypnotist. But there's no correlation between liberalism, conservatism, and hypnosis, and there's no correlation between intellectance, or for that matter, IQ, and hypnosis. But still, people who have a proneness to enter these states of absorption seem to be disposed towards hypnosis as well. Perhaps the nicest clinical study of these kinds of imaginative involvements now comes to us from Josephine Hilgard, who is a psychiatrist and psychologist at Stanford University, who identified imaginative involvements in a very large number of domains, chiefly in reading, but also in drama. There are some people some actors when they engage in a role, they just go through the motions of the role. There are other actors that become very deeply involved in the role. They don't just act like the person the character they're playing. They become the character they're playing. Marlon